second gen Chevy Camaro and Pontiac Firebird should have been way more successful in the 1970 Trans Am than they actually were. They were lower with better aerodynamics and they had a wider track than the first gen models. And the steering linkage was moved from behind the front axle to ahead of the front axle. Now this makes the car just a little bit more predictable when it's on the limit. But somehow it just didn't pan out that way. In the 1970 SCCA Trans Am, Chevrolet scored just 2 victories and only one of these was from the factory Chaparral team with the new second gen model. The other victory was actually by Milt Minter in a year-old first gen car run by Roy Woods. But if the Camaro fared poorly in 1970, it was still way better than the Pontiac Firebird. Now for 1970, the factory Pontiac team of TG Racing took a new approach. They ran a single car team and they didn't build any customer cars. So this was pretty much the complete opposite to what they did in 1969. And they produced a new second gen Firebird that was an absolute work of art. Now General Motors were late in bringing their second gen pony cars to market. New models would normally arrive around about September, but the Camaro and Firebird were 5 months late, and hence they're often referred to as 1970 and a half models. And naturally, the late arrival of the Gen 2 cars had a knock-on effect for the GM Trans Am teams, and obviously this would have impacted their on-track performances. Anyway, Pontiac duly produced a Trans Am variant of the second gen Firebird, and by all accounts it was even more focused than the first gen model. Among the many highlights was a Herb Adams designed shaker hood. This was a rear opening scoop attached to the motor that popped up through a hole cut in the hood. It gulped in cold air from the base of the windshield and it was wrapped in a shroud to prevent air leakage. Now for 1970, the SCCA changed the regulations regarding front spoilers. It was no longer a requirement to fit a factory front spoiler. But regardless, Pontiac produced the Trans Am with what they called wheel opening air spoilers. Now these were spats that were attached to the forward part of the front and rear wheel openings to improve airflow around the car. And there was also a massive 3-piece rear spoiler attached to the deck lid and the upper rear quarters to improve rear downforce. And in fact, this spoiler was so effective that Chevrolet copied it for their second gen Camaro Z28. Then there were the TG Racing Trans Am race cars. These featured acid-dipped bodies and really beautiful roll cages. The team figured out a way to fit rear tyres on the front for extra front-end grip. Now even Penske Racing couldn't figure out a way to make this work. And they also fitted the cars with power steering and hydraulic assist power brakes. And they used state-of-the-art Earhart disc brakes. Now General Motors produced special front spindles and other front upright pieces that were fitted to both the Firebird and the Camaro Trans Am cars. And Herb Adams and Paul Lamar created a really trick Watts link for the rear with a whole heap of adjustment. And they designed the rear end to run negative camber. And they also designed several different exhaust layouts, including one that exited either side of the car to reduce cabin temperature. And so the TG Racing team built some epic cars, but there were 2 major problems. Now the first of these obviously was the late arrival of the second gen cars. The team finally received 2 cars from Pontiac in around February of 1970. Remember, the first Trans Am race was in early April, so that meant the team had to do 80-hour weeks just to make the first race. And then there was the motor. Now the SCCA finally allowed D-stroked motors for the first time in 1970, but for TG Racing the options were limited. They used a 400 cubic inch lump with 3.25 inch mains. Now the tunnel port heads from 1969 were obviously not allowed, so they used the Ram Air 4 heads instead. But as a Trans Am race motor, and remember, the Trans Am had a maximum engine size rule of 5,000 cc's, so the big Pontiac unit was actually really unsuitable. It was too heavy, it lacked power, and the main bearings kept being starved of oil. and so they broke with alarming regularity. Now, after a marathon effort, TG Racing arrived at the first Trans Am race of 1970 with the car fitted with a cheetah block. This was actually a Pontiac developed block with a deck height that was 1 inch shorter than the regular 400 block. Now, it produced around 430 horsepower on the dyno, which was less than a small block Chevy, but it was still about 50 horsepower more than the motor using the 400 block. And it looked for all the world like the correct block. But SCCA Tech Inspector John Timanus took one look at it and he knew straight away it was a cheetah block. And he told the team to bring a legal motor for the next race or else. Now, Jerry Titus started and finished that race in 7th position. And this was despite having to run without the big rear spoiler because it hadn't yet been homologated. And in fact, this was the only race in which the motor didn't break. And unfortunately, this was the theme for the first half of the 1970 Trans Am. So, TG Racing probably had the best chassis on the grid, but the worst motor. But worse was yet to come. During practice for round 7 of the series at Road America, Titus suffered steering failure. He skidded into an abutment on the Bill Mitchell Bridge, and tragically he died more than 2 weeks later on August the 5th. Now, Jerry Titus was the glue that held everyone together at TG Racing. Everyone loved him, including the guys at Pontiac. And with Jerry gone, Terry Godsall moved the whole operation to Canada. The team ran a Firebird in round 9 of the series at Watkins Glen for John Cords. And then David Hobbs joined aboard a second Firebird in the Kent race. Hobbs did manage to go the full distance in the final race at Riverside, but he was way down in 9th. And that was just about the end of TG Racing. Now, there was another team running Firebirds in the 1970 Trans Am. Todco Racing was based out of Canada and ran a 1969 Firebird for Craig Fisher. Remember him? Anyway, unlike the 1969 TG Racing Firebirds, this car had all the correct bodywork, which also meant it was running a Pontiac motor, and of course that meant it was both slow and unreliable. Fisher did manage to finish round 2 of the series at Lime Rock, but he was about 30 laps down on the winner. Now, this car disappeared after round 3, but Todco Racing reappeared in round 8 with a newly built second-gen Firebird. It was driven by Derek Johnson, and again it was both slow and unreliable. It made one more appearance at Watkins Glen, where Johnson lasted 8 laps before the motor blew. And that was Pontiac's lot in what was the greatest year in the SCCA Trans Am. Now, that might have been the end of the story if not for that bloke, Herb Adams. He came back in 1971 with a bunch of buddies from Pontiac and the most unlikely of race cars. It was a 1964 Pontiac Tempest. Wasn't even a GTO, it was a Tempest. Adams originally bought the Tempest in September of 1963 but traded it to his dad for his mum to drive. And then he bought it back in 1968 for his wife Sandy to drive. She eventually decided she wanted something newer, and then Adams discovered, almost by accident, that the GTO had actually been homologated for racing in 1965. Now, Adams and a couple of Pontiac engineers converted the car for SCCA club racing before it was completely rebuilt for the 1971 Trans Am. Now, Adams formed an incorporation made up of Pontiac engineers, and they were also helped out by a young Harry Quackenboss, and it was Harry who's helped me with this story. So they basically split monies made from racing and from the sponsorship that they gained. And each guy had their own part of the car that they were fully responsible for. The Tempest, of course, was a full chassis car, but it had coil spring rear suspension. The front uprights and brake architecture were actually the same as those used on the 1969 TG Racing Firebirds. The motor was a D-stroke unit but fitted with a dry sump system, which the SCCA finally allowed in 1971. And it was topped with Ram Air 4 heads. And it was a neat piece, and these guys were getting around 465 to 480 horsepower, and most importantly, it was finally reliable. Anyway, Adams asked Bob Tullius if he'd be interested in testing the car, and Tullius was really impressed and he agreed to race it in the Trans Am. Now, according to Harry, Herb Adams had a whole heap of chartreuse paint that he wanted to douse the car in. But the team stepped in and stopped him. In the end, they decided to replicate the colours of the 1964 Swiss cheese Catalina drag cars, which was silver on the outside and blue on the inside, and thus it gained the nickname the Grey Ghost. Anyway, this was a small operation run on a very small budget. But regardless, the Grey Ghost was an impressive Trans Am car. Of course, by 1971, all the manufacturers had bailed except American Motors, who were working with Penske Racing. At Lime Rock in the wet, Tullius started off the back of the grid following clutch failure in qualifying, but he drove through the field to lie second to Mark Donoghue in the factory Javelin. And he was gaining every lap, and every lap the crowd gave him a standing ovation. But with 15 laps to run, the Tempest rolled into the pits with a blown head gasket. At Mid-Ohio, Tullius also surged through the field after starting in position 7. He was chasing down leader George Fulmer in the Roy Woods Javelin. But come the pit stops, and Fulmer was serviced in less than 1 minute, while Tullius was stationary for nearly 4 minutes. In the end, he finished 5th, took another 5th at Michigan, and finished 4th at Breyer. And of course, the little team couldn't afford to run the full schedule, but it was a hugely impressive effort. Now, TG Racing made their one and only appearance of the 1971 Trans Am in the Breyer race, and it was a strange sort of an effort with a single Firebird for Larry Dent. It was more of a sponsorship arrangement than any sort of serious effort to try and win the race. You see, the Firebird was sponsored by BF Goodrich and dubbed the Tire Bird, and it ran on radial street tyres as part of the sponsorship package. Dent ultimately finished 16th and last. For 1972, the Herb Adams team returned with a newly built Pontiac Firebird. It was referred to within the team as the Junkyard Firebird because it was built from a wreck. They replaced everything forward of the firewall, including the front subframe, which had been acid dipped. The motor used one of the Pontiac development blocks with provision for an internal dry sump. Only around 50 of these blocks had ever been produced, mostly for NASCAR Grand Am, and it ran an internal dry sump developed by Tom Nell. They got the nose of the Firebird really low to the ground to make it more aerodynamic, and it wore special Pontiac developed forged spindles and steering linkage. The wheels were Motor Wheel Corp and they were wrapped in Goodyear Blue Streak tyres, and this was not a Pontiac factory project, even though most of the guys on the crew worked for Pontiac. In fact, they paid for just about everything themselves. Anyway, Tony DiLorenzo drove the Firebird first time out and he finished 3rd, and from then on it was driven by Milt Minter. Minter finished 2nd to George Fulmer at Breyer, but confessed that he was taking it easy. You see, he figured the little team needed the $3,000 for finishing 2nd more than they needed to go home with nothing if he broke the car. Fulmer, of course, was aboard one of the 2 factory Javelins. And then, in round 3 at Mid-Ohio, Minter won. Amazingly, after 5 years, this was the very first Trans Am race victory for Pontiac, even though Pontiac no longer had skin in the game. And in fact, the Adams team were actually pretty lucky. See, during race morning warm-up, the rear axle tube broke. The team got John Morton, the BRE racer, to weld it up, while Harry Quackenboss aligned it. And fortunately, it held together for the race. And as it transpired, this would be the only Pontiac race victory in the original 1966-72 Trans Am era. At Watkins Glen, the motor blew while Minter was leading. He placed 4th at Donnybrook and 2nd at Road America. And the crazy thing is, despite the Trans Am attracting some of the biggest names in the sport, the SCCA waited until 1972 before finally awarding a Trans Am Drivers' Championship. And George Fulmer became the very first SCCA Trans Am Drivers' Champion aboard the factory Javelin. He actually had a pretty good year in 1972 because he was drafted in to drive the Penske Racing Porsche 917 following Mark Donohue's big testing shunt, and he also went on to win the 1972 SCCA Can-Am Championship. But the feel-good story of the 1972 Trans Am was that Milt Minter finished second in the Drivers' Championship aboard the Firebird, built and largely funded by a small crew of enthusiasts punching way above their weight. Anyway folks, that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed this little two-part story on Pontiac in the Trans Am. If you did, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and tap that little bell thingy down below so you get a notification when I post up a new vid. Anyway, until next time, we will catch you then. See ya, bye bye.